Chapter 39. A light drizzle misted the air and soaked the streets as Lay and Dane made their way down the streets of high walls. "You're sure Pierce will be all right," Dane said.
"We've done this before, Dane. He knows what to do," Lay sighed. "Do you suppose we should talk to Greykill about this?"
"Let's just get Eulalia. Greykill and Taral, we take that as it comes."
"Very well."
The 10th bell of morning had rung, and Togren Square was unusually quiet. Those refugees with jobs had made their way to the workhouses and foundries, and most of those who remained were sleeping or gathered around communal cooking points, preparing the morning meal. Dane had lost his cloak in the sewers, but his chainmail shirt and the sword at his belt still drew attention. Back at the Manticore, Dane had borrowed some boot black from Dassy, the innkeeper, and used it to cover the Denith symbol on his sword. He was tired of the unwanted attention he received for bearing the sigil of the dragon-marked house. Dane and Lay made their way through the maze of tents to the large black canopy in the center. The dwarf doorman stood at the opening flap. "What do you want?" he asked. "We're looking for Eulalia," Dane said. "Councillor Taral is not accustomed to receiving guests at this hour. He'll be making his rounds later. See him then." "We're not looking for Councillor Taral. We want to see the girl, Eulalia, his servant." "You want to see the councillor's servant? You see the councillor first."
"Can't you just ask?"
Lay began. "I know my duties, lady," the dwarf said. "So do I," Dane said. All the anger and frustration that had been building since Jode's death burst. Dane slammed his right elbow into the dwarf's nose, forcing him back into the tent. Dane darted in after him. The dwarf flailed wildly, but a sweeping kick from Dane knocked the guard off his feet. A moment later, Dane had a knee on the guard's chest and punched him again and again until he stopped moving. Lay slipped in behind him.
"How are you going to explain that to Taral?" she said, looking at the battered guard.
Dane looked away, embarrassed by the moment of frenzy. "If we expose a conspiracy of monsters in the community, I'd hope he'd overlook a few bruises." They were standing in the entry chamber, where they'd eaten dinner with Taral. Only now, bedrolls were scattered across the floor. 6 people had been sleeping in the chamber, but all had since departed. Dane dragged the dwarf on top of a blanket. There was a rustle of fabric, and the inner door of the tent opened. Dane tensed and prepared for action, but it was Eulalia. Her eyes widened as she saw Dane and the fallen guard. Dane stood and held out his hands in a gesture of peace, then gave a quick nod to Lay. "Eulalia, it's all right," he said. "We're not here to hurt you." Behind him, Lay began to make mystical gestures over a crystal shard, weaving a minor enchantment into the gem. Dane slowly approached Eulalia. "We just want to talk. Everything will be all right now." The girl watched Dane fearfully, her stone teeth shining out between half-parted lips. She didn't run, but there was no sign of understanding in her eyes. "Calm down," Dane said gently. "Nothing will hurt you. Just wait. Lay is going to help you talk to us."
"I'm ready, Dane,"
Lay said. The crystal in her hand glowed faintly. "Eulalia," Dane said, "have you seen our friend Jode, the halfling?" He gestured with his hand to indicate Jode's small size. "Recently?" He watched Eulalia's emotionless face, then glanced over at Lei. Anything?
I don't think she can understand you, Lei said. She's afraid. Wait! She remembers you and Jode from the dinner. I think she's afraid that what happened to Jode will happen to you.
Dane turned back to the girl. What happened, Eulalia? Who harmed our friend? Dane? Counselor Taral entered the room leaning on a cane and holding a mug of tal in his hand. What are you doing here? And Lei? Yes. Is something wrong? Dane caught Lei's eyes and flicked a glance at Eulalia. Lei blinked once. Dane walked over to Taral. Counselor, last night my friend Jode was killed, and I believe Eulalia knows who did it. Taral waved his hand dismissively. Preposterous! Eulalia wouldn't harm a soul. He broke off, noticing the unconscious guard. What is this? We need to finish talking to her, Counselor. This mystery, it threatens us all, including you. The old man glared at Dane. You presume too much, Captain. Beating and questioning my servants. Leave now. Taral, you need to listen to me. Something terrible is hidden in high walls. Hugel and Monin were not what they seemed. I have had enough of this, Captain. Eulalia whimpered. Lei had been concealing the glowing crystal in her hand. She flung it away as hard as she could. Lei, what?
Dane? It's him.
Dane looked at Taral. The counselor laughed. I see. You were watching Eulalia's thoughts while you talked to me. Oh, very good. Dane's sword was in his hand in an instant, the point leveled at Taral's throat. What are you talking about? Lei winced and clutched her head, as if the visions she'd drawn from Eulalia's mind was causing her pain.
Inside. It's inside.
I hope you don't mind, Dane, Taral said, his voice growing colder. But I've just invited a few friends to join us. Hugel emerged from the rear of the tent. 2 more people walked through the front flap. A young boy with a feral expression and a middle-aged man whose left arm had been severed at the elbow. If they come any closer, you'll be dead, Dane warned. He flicked the point of his sword across the old man's throat, drawing a spot of blood. Across the room, Lei drew her dagger and set her back against the wall of the tent, her face twisted in a rictus of pain. But whatever was bothering her, she seemed to be fighting it and winning. I think not, said Taral. There was a flash of movement, followed by a cold pain at Dane's throat. He fell to the floor, every muscle refusing to respond. The counselor kicked his sword out of his hand. I'm so glad you left your warforged behind, Taral said, retracting his long barbed tongue. He would have proved more difficult to deal with. As he spoke, Dane saw that the puckered scar on his throat was opening. A layer of raw muscle oozed out of the wound, flowing over Taral's flesh like a sickened skin. Within seconds, Taral seemed to have doubled in mass. He threw aside his cane and turned to face Lei, glaring at her from eyes newly sunken in deep fleshy sockets. Now, whatever shall we do about you?
I'm not afraid of you, monster, Lei said. Her voice was calm, and she held her dagger in a throwing grip.
The young boy hissed, and in the instant Lei glanced at him, Taral was in motion. His left arm whipped forward and a long tentacle of flesh lashed out of his sleeve, catching Lei's wrist and jerking the dagger from her hand. A second later, he had his right hand around her throat. "Lei," Terral said as she gasped for air. He studied the color of her hair and skin. "An artificer, it would seem. And from Seer." Then he noticed the bare circle on her fingers, where her house signet had been. "Could it be?" He sniffed the air around her, like a hound searching for a scent. Finally, he lifted her off the ground with one hand, turned her back toward him, and with his other hand, he brushed aside her hair, revealing the tip of the mark of making rising above her collar. Dane raged within, but he couldn't move. He watched helplessly as Terral stabbed Lei with his venomous tongue and let her fall to the ground. "Fortune shines on us again, my brothers," Terral said, raising his bloody pulsing arms above his head. "Another true mark is ours, for the taking. The call has gone out. The master awaits. Hugo, take her below." "And this one?" Long claws had sprouted from the boy's right hand, and he ran these talons along Dane's throat. "Take him as well. Why waste blood and brain? One way or the other, he will serve our master." Chapter 40. Dane woke in chains. His arms were stretched painfully above his head, bound by steel manacles and suspended by a hook in the hard stone wall. His legs were unbound, but his feet barely touched the floor below. The air was full of liquid noise, a hypnotic melange of bubbling, flowing sounds. But the stench ruined any calming effects that the sounds might have. Sulfur, burning flesh, and exotic spices mixed together to form a horrible, overwhelming scent. Dane opened his eyes, just far enough to peer at his surroundings. The chamber was dim, and it took a moment for his eyes to adjust to the darkness. He was in a long stone chamber with arched ceilings that disappeared into shadow. There were no windows, and Dane guessed they were deep underground. Beyond the cloying odor, the air had the same stale scent as the sewers below Sharn. This must be Kyber's Gate, he thought. The room came into focus, and he could see tanks and tools lined up along the walls to his left and right. Strange objects floated in vats of luminescent liquid, but he was too far away to make out details. He spotted Lei's pack lying on the floor a few feet away from him, but there was no sign of his sword. Then he saw Lei. A table was in the center of the chamber. In the dim light, he hadn't seen it at first. The surface was curved and covered with opalescent enamel, and the reflected light of the glowing fluid glittered on the dark surface. Lei lay spread-eagled on top of the table, arms and legs pinned by heavy manacles. A few odd objects were scattered about. Vials of fluid, knives of various shapes and sizes, and a handful of crystals. I wonder if those are Alina's shards, Dane thought. "There's no point in pretending to be unconscious, Dane. I heard the shift in your breathing." Terrell's voice came out of the shadows to Dane's right. Wrapped in his armor of flesh, Terrell's voice was deep and had a horrible wet rasp. Terrell stepped into the light. He had changed into a loose cloak, and he glared at Dane with a terrible grin on his raw, bloody face. Dane raised his head and looked Terrell in the eye. He could see Hugo and a few other shadowy figures lurking in the darkness. Hugo was wearing Dane's sword. He caught Dane's eye and giggled. "What happened to you, Tyrell? What have you done?" Tyrell moved with astonishing speed. Dane never saw the slap that slammed his head back against the wall. "Mind your tone, Dane, or I might take your tongue, or worse. I've pushed Eulalia about as far as I can. Perhaps you should be my next toy." Dane glared at Tyrell. He could feel a trickle of blood where his right cheek had grazed the wall. "It is not a question of what I did. It is a question of what was done to me. I was saved. You wandered the Moonlands for months. In that time, did you ever find any survivors?" "We found nothing. Nothing that could be saved. Yet, I came to Sharn with over 100, myself included." He glared up at Dane, his eyes crazed behind his horrible mask of flesh. "I was there on the night of the morning, Dane. I saw the mists with my own eyes. I could never explain it to you. It was pure, transcendent beauty. Land and life reshaped without regard for mercy or reason. It was over in a moment. I was still alive, but I could not move. I could only lie there, feeling my body slowly shifting from life to death. No sovereign lord came to defend me. No silver flame shielded my soul. But at the last moment, when the light had gone from my eyes, they found me. They pulled me back from death, filling me." He ran a hand across the ghastly layer of muscle that covered his skin. "With new life. Together, we found others. Their mortality burned out of them by the morning. They were vessels waiting to be filled by the power from below." Dane glanced at Lay, hoping she would stir. He needed to buy more time. "I see that power from below bought you a nice home here in the sewers." Tyrell hissed, and his barbed tongue flickered into view for a moment. "There are forces in the deeper darkness that you can't begin to understand. The world could have been theirs in ages past, and it will be in the days to come. The morning is the first sign of their return. Through our war, we destroyed our nation. Through our magic, we broke the world itself. Now the children of madness are returning. And this time, all will fall before them." "Sure," Dane said. "I can see it. I mean, there's 100 of you, right? Aside from the ones we killed, of course. That's an unstoppable army, no question." A second slap slammed his head against the wall. "This is only the beginning," Tyrell said. "Our numbers grow every day. Our master can reshape body and mind, granting gifts or stripping strength away." Dane remembered the old woman with the basilisk eye, who had been fully human only a few weeks later. He saw movement in the vats of liquid, and wondered what they contained, and how long he could avoid finding out. "You will see," Tyrell said, gripping Dane's chin with one moist hand and staring into his eyes. "You have strength, yes. I think you shall serve at my side once your mind has been properly adjusted." A chill ran down Dane's spine, but he kept talking. So by day you fan the anger of the Syrian refugees, and by night you turn them into monsters? My master gives us the power to act in our anger, Dane. He allows us to take our rightful place in the new age that lies ahead. And Jode, the powers of your companion will be most useful, as will the gifts of the young lady, Terrell said, glancing back at the unconscious Lay. All flesh is as clay in the hands of my master. He strips the powers away from the beasts of earth and air and grafts these powers to our flesh. Now, at last, the gifts of the dragons are ours for the taking. He gestured to the far end of the room, where Dane could just make out a shelf of flasks in clay vials. With the power of the binding stones, the dragon's mark can be stripped from this weak human flesh. Once it has been concentrated into this purest form, it is only a matter of time until that power is mine. It is time, Dane thought. Then he frowned. Time for what? He approaches, Terrell whispered. Lay heard voices, but she couldn't make out the words. She couldn't move, even to open her eyes. Where was she? Lying down, that much she could tell. The sound of water was all around her, and there was a horrible smell, yet one that seemed strangely familiar. How quickly we forget, she thought. Or did she? Why would she have thought such a thing? Her body was tilted, her head lower than her feet, and the blood was pounding in her forehead. The surface beneath her was cool and smooth. She could see vague, flickering illumination to either side of her, as if light was shining through water. She could almost hear a voice in the distance, calling her name. Or was that just another stray thought? A figure moved in the light, blurred and indistinct. All is well, my dear, said the figure. It was Hadran. His hand touched her forehead, brushing the hair back from her face. Her vision was still blurry, but she could see him in her mind, proud and stately in his robes of blue and gold. His gray mustaches were carefully waxed, and he pulled at one as he smiled at her. There is so much to be done, but you're safe now. Hadran picked up a tall, thin urn and poured the contents out next to her. Due to the curved surface and the tilt of the table, the fluid gathered at the back of her head and the small of her back. It was cold, and a tingling sensation spread across her skin. He tried to speak, but her mouth still wouldn't move. How could this be? There are many mysteries in the world, Hadran said, squeezing her shoulder comfortingly. He poured the contents of a second beaker into the basin, and the tingling increased to a sharper sting. Only the mad can understand them all, for they have gone beyond understanding. Relax, my love. Despite the pain at her neck, Hadran's words were soothing, and she began to drift. But then the image of Counselor Terral flashed through her mind, his skinless armor wet with blood. I do not take orders from excoriates. You have no place here. Those have been Domo's words. Domo the Warforged. Hadran's Warforged. The thought brought her back to her senses, but she still couldn't open her eyes or move her limbs. Hadran still had a hand on her shoulder. He was spreading an object across her chest. Jewelry? A necklace? Let it go, he said soothingly. All is forgotten. All is forgiven. You are finally home. And nothing else matters. Someone was combing her hair, straightening it and tugging at it with a dozen small brushes. The pain across her back was becoming more specific, concentrated into distinct points, as if a dozen small needles were pushing slowly into her flesh. The light before her eyes faded until it was the barest flickering of firelight. The image of fire brought new thoughts. Fire, flame, flame wind, the Sphinx, and her words. You killed him, Lei. Those watching you have plans for you, and a life with Hadran was not what they wished. A surge of anger rushed through her, and she managed to lift her head a little. This couldn't be real. Hadran is dead. Lei! Lei! Let it go! It was Dane. He caught her head between his hands and pushed her back down into the cold, into the stinging. Small rocks had been scattered across the surface of the table, or were they on her skin? It was so hard to tell. Dane's fingers continued to brush gently against her forehead, driving away the pain. It's all over, Lei, he said, massaging her scalp. Forget your fears. We're together. And... Lei! Wake up! Now! It was Dane's voice again, but louder and urgent. For a moment, she was on the battlefield of Seer, with blood and steel all around, and in that instant she followed the command without thought. She opened her eyes. It was not a hand that she had felt on her forehead. It was a tentacle. Her first sight was of slick, purple skin, a round mouth lined with needles' teeth, and deep black eyes with glowing pupils. 4 tentacles ringed the vicious mouth of the creature that was bending over her, and they were carefully holding her head in place. She could see a barbed, razor-sharp tongue emerging from the mouth, ascending toward her forehead, and with every ounce of strength she possessed, she threw her head to the side. She broke free of the confining tentacles. The piercing tongue scraped against the side of her head but failed to penetrate her skull. Hissing, the figure stepped back. At first, she thought she was still dreaming, silhouetted against the light. Her enemy seemed to be a man, tall, thin, and regal. He wore a Syrian robe of rich brocade, covered with swirling, interlocking lines of golden thread. But his head was a violet nightmare, powerful tentacles writhing around the lamprey mouth. Stinging thoughts will send our work awry, she thought. No, it thought. It was almost impossible to separate the alien thoughts from her own. She could sense its aggravation at the delay in its work. Enforced tranquility drains the derivations of shadows. Release your fears. Embrace your fate. Her head was beginning to clear, and she could feel her limbs again. It felt as if the icy liquid had eaten through the back of her clothing and tiny crystals had formed along her skin. She raised her head and stared into the creature's inhuman eyes. Go to Delur, she thought. Zoriat, it returned, naming the plane of madness. We must ride the imperfect mind. It moved in, bending over her, the steel manacles pinning her in place. The suckers on the beast's 4 tentacles latched onto the sides of her head. There was no chance of breaking free now. Release your thoughts. Embrace eternity in me. The piercing tongue stabbed down,